Hi, welcome back to another episode of Analyze Scripts. This is Dr. Katrina Fury. I'm a psychiatrist, and today, every time, I'm joined by my friend and colleague,
Portia Pendleton. I am a social worker.
And we are so glad that you are joining us here today. All right, well, why don't we jump right into shrinking,
Sure.
episodes 4 through 6.
So where did we leave off? I think
one thing we left off on was really wondering if we would see Paul and Gabby in session, and we did get to see that a little bit, and I thought of you immediately. I was like,
me too.
I wonder what Portia's thinking.
Yeah, so Gabby we see in kind of like a
Couples
couples therapy, which I was like, I love this for you.
Yes.
And I kind of noted
that the woman wasn't wearing shoes.
Oh, I didn't.
I did notice that. I always wonder
We're good at picking up on like the space that they're in, right? When therapy is going on. I did not pick up on the bare feet.
Not Gabby had her shoes on.
Correct,
It was the female
correct.
patient of the couple who took them off.
Yeah, okay. So
how do you feel about it?
I don't love that.
I don't love it either.
I just don't like I wouldn't say like I don't like feet. I just, I think everyone should do their own thing at their home,
Right. I feel like it conveys a level of comfort in the therapy office that I'm not sure is appropriate. So, just kind of makes me wonder. Right, exactly. Or someone with a neurocognitive issue or, something like that. Right, like a fully functioning adult woman in the presence of an adult
like
professional. And there is a racial difference, if I remember correctly. It's just interesting. And those are the kind of details I wonder, like, did they know what they were doing or not?
Yeah. Like, did she have her shoes on? They were like, no, take them off.
Take them off. Yeah. What does that mean? Yeah.
No, that's a good catch. They asked Gabby at one point, like, well, what do you do? And I thought that was something that happens, I don't know if I would say like frequently, but like it comes up. I think,
for sure.
There's so many different ways to respond to that question, depending on what they're asking, depending on what your relationship with the patient is, depending on, why they want to know. I mean, there's so many kind of ways to come back at that. I think it was interesting because Gabby is like getting divorced, or she is divorced, she's in that process. And I think that made me feel like, sometimes patients, and, you not having to do with the response or what you then say, but like, are going through something maybe that like you went through, or ask something that like,
it's close to home.
If that was your therapist, that would be a moment. And you really, obviously of course are then having a boundary and really like kind of putting it back on them. But like that happens sometimes. You just kind of have to swallow whatever emotion might come up for you and then, reflect back and kind of make it about the patient.
I don't know if she did that though. I feel like she kind of answered it as what she would do. And I remember thinking like, again, this is a show. It's theatrical. And especially I think we see with Jimmy, I just keep really getting more and more disappointed with his approach. But I think it highlights the importance of boundaries in the therapeutic relationship by showing what happens when there aren't good boundaries.
Right.
And even something like that happens a lot. When a patient's like, well, what would you do? Especially if it's like a personal issue. I feel like this used to happen to me more in my medical training, like especially rotating like in the ICU or the neuro ICU when you're talking with families about like end of life care or things like that. A lot of times families feel so understandably overwhelmed and distraught and like they really don't know like what is the best decision at this point. And they are really relying on your medical expertise to sort of guide them into when is it time to move from a lot of invasive measures to what we call more comfort measures. In that situation, it feels more appropriate to me. A lot of times in those situations, patients or their families families would say like, what would you do if it was your mom or things like that? That's hard.
Yeah.
In situations like that, it feels a little more. Again, you don't have to say like, well, if it was my mom, I would do this, or when it was my mom, I did this. But it does feel like guiding them a little more directly can be helpful in someone's time of like overwhelming, distress. But in therapy situations, especially I think in couples therapy, where I thought this, scene really demonstrated so well like a reason I don't do couples therapy, because it always is so hard to like be the therapist and not pick a side, or for the couple themselves, the different members, to feel like you're not picking a side. And I loved when she was like, "Don't do that to me," to the guy when he was trying to do it. I don't know.
Yeah, that was funny. She was, nope, we're not using that point system. Nope, I did not say that. I thought that was funny.
Right, like, oh, see, I win, or I got another. So she's like, nope, I'm shutting that down. So I thought that was really good.
And again, like a little bit playful. And I think like it seems like, she had that rapport with them. So it felt like it landed well. And they maybe were like, ha 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 inside. Like, okay.
Right.
We'll stop.
Did you notice any details about her office?
So I did notice the stickers all over her laptop. Yes. I noticed her scrunchies, right?
Yes, like on the lamp or something.
I thought it was fun. I thought it was like it fit her character, personality, vibe, style in the show with like colors. I thought it almost, I guess, seemed a little like I don't want to say like childlike, but like her desk was like, and because it was in the office where patients could see, it's like it just seemed a little, I don't know, like
a little immature. I was thinking like this would be great if she's working with teenagers or kids or stuff like that. So I wonder, treating this adult couple, like what their view of those decorations were.
Yeah.
But again, I totally agree. It definitely like fits her personality and vibe. And it's so different from Jimmy's office, which I thought was much more like traditional, pretty classic. I thought also well done therapy office.
Yep.
You had the desk, again, his degrees on the wall. I don't love that. We talked about that in our episode about What About Bob? But the desk was behind where he sits with his patient. Yep. I think maybe there was like a little coffee table in between them, but it wasn't obstructive.
Right. And in episode 1, we saw that there was another option for seating, right? One of the patients was almost like...
Right, kind of next to him. Yeah, he had like 2 chairs and a couch, which I think is nice to give people sort of a choice. He had these beautiful big windows. It was a nice big office. Space. Yeah, I really liked it. And then Paul's office, I don't remember the details as much, which probably, again, signifies his like rigid boundaries.
True.
There's probably not a lot of personal effects in there. It's probably really like to the book, which makes sense.
And like I think for both of Jimmy and Paul's office, like it, as I guess appropriately, like it was more, a male vibe, right? Like, leather.
Yeah.
Like darker. And then Gabby's was really like bright and colorful.
Yeah, totally agree. So again, I feel like that's going to be a theme as we keep doing this podcast. It's just, I love analyzing their offices.
Yeah.
And I didn't see any sharp stuff in their offices yet, which is like great. That's very appropriate.
Yeah. And I would expect that with Paul,
100%. Like he knows, you sit closer to the door. Like he knows the drill here.
He's done this once or twice.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, we continue to see
oh God,
Sean and Jimmy's inappropriate relationship. I think in episode 4, they like carpool to therapy together, right?
I know.
And I was just like, oh my gosh, stop, please.
I mean, I love too that we're like talking about it like that is just the most egregious thing. But let's remember he's living with him,
exactly,
like, in his pool house.
Yeah.
And I did write down, I thought a really funny line was like when they got there, Sean's like, why did we have to do this here? Can't we like talk at home? And Jimmy's like, well, my notebook's here.
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
Yeah. I was curious what he was going to say. Well, we have to keep this, boundary. I was like, well, it's not.
Like the horse has left the stable, so to speak. And in episode 4, we really see like 3 different therapeutic relationships. Jimmy and Sean, Jimmy and Wally, who's the female patient with OCD, and then Jimmy and Grace. And we're seeing how, like, oh my gosh, turns out his approach isn't working so great.
Right.
So we have Grace, who's not returning his calls since he saw her back with the husband that he encouraged her to leave.
And told her, I won't see you.
I won't be your therapist anymore if you stay with him. And that's like, ooh, real harmful thing to say, Again, like I would imagine in her relationship with her husband, the love already feels conditional. Like she has to do X, Y, and Z to avoid him yelling at her or maybe beating her, who knows. And then Jimmy just sort of replays
Yeah.
that in the therapeutic relationship, which is really unfortunate. What did you think about the scene with Wally, the OCD patient?
So I initially was like, oh, this is really the patient to be doing this with, right? Like
Yes, the
a
exposure
home
and response.
exposure. You're sitting, in on her couch and,
In her
coaching
outside
her.
clothes.
Yep. And then like hopefully, again, like coaching her through maybe a panic attack, like maybe some kind of response and like helping her stay as calm as possible and then giving her, the confidence that she can do this.
Right.
And then, she sits down and I'm like, wow, this is going great.
This
like,
is a great depiction of ERP.
yeah, this is it. And then she leans over and, goes to lean in for a kiss. And I that came out of left field as I'm like, yay, ERP in action. And I was like, wow, like, and then I'm thinking, 10 seconds later, 2 seconds later, like, of course, he's in her home, like, I feel like they probably didn't have a lot of prep for this. Like, I feel like he just is doing these things instead of like, okay, we're doing this really planful thing. She also, I feel like, has a little bit of a loose boundary because Brian, right, had come
barged in
her session and like shared all this private information about Jimmy. And then again, so it's like she now has kind of moved from patient with this clear boundary to this weird, inappropriate role.
100%. I agree. I was also hopeful about the ERP. That stands for exposure and response prevention therapy, which is the gold standard treatment for things like OCD to help patients like learn how to implement coping skills in the moment and ride out that wave without engaging in compulsive behaviors like changing from your outside clothes into your inside clothes sounds like what she was struggling with.
I liked when he was like, why do you need me to take my shoes off? And she's like, oh, well, I've been to Japan. And he was like, no, you haven't. And she's like, well, they do it there. And he's like, no, like this is, because again, that is absolutely appropriate, like within a cultural context. And like, is that why she is doing that? No.
Right. It's more for her in line with the OCD. And then she leans into a kiss him, not once, but twice.
Yes.
And I was like, wow, here is, erotic transference right in our faces. When you're doing therapy with patients, it's not uncommon for patients and sometimes even the therapists themselves to develop feelings about each other. Like, why wouldn't you? You're both humans. You both come into the room with your own experiences.
It's a level of care.
A level of care, exactly. And sometimes patients haven't really felt that level of care or attention in other relationships before. So you might develop these feelings of longing or love or even sometimes sexual feelings. And again, that's where it's very important that the therapist has good training, good supervision, and knows how to sort of help the patient verbalize that and learn that it's safe to talk about all feelings, even the uncomfortable ones, and then manage it. Unlike Dr. Nikki from You, if you go back, who sort of exploits that and takes advantage of his patients when that stuff comes up. So again, everything from like how close are your chairs, physical boundaries of touch and then things like that are also important here. Erotic transference is when a patient develops these sort of loving or sometimes sexual feelings toward their therapist. A lot of times we think, it might start off in their subconscious, like they're not totally aware of it, but then it becomes conscious, like in this case where Wally tries to kiss Jimmy. Erotic countertransference is the fancy way of saying, the therapist is having those feelings toward the patient. Right. So like transference is a feeling being directed from the patient to the therapist. Countertransference is the other way around. So again, this was sort of like a maybe silly way of depicting that, but I thought it was interesting. And like you were saying, Portia, how much did that earlier boundary violation with Brian just storming in contribute to, further boundary unravelings, which can happen. That's why boundaries are so important right from the get-go.
Right. Of course, you would never want to be, have someone in your personal life slam the door open, come in the room and when you're in with the patient and share personal information about you. I feel like to a degree with what's shared, you can potentially make a repair talking about it, like having maybe a couple sessions even about it, like, and seeing if you can get past it. And if you can't, then obviously you're making a referral. But, I think maybe that did happen. Maybe we didn't see it. Again, this is a TV show, but, because we didn't, I'm assuming that it didn't happen.
Right.
And also Jimmy just seems to have extraordinarily poor boundaries. So,
And was he always that way and it got worse in his grief? Or is this like a 180?
I don't know. I think maybe there was like a little flare of it, like a tiny, maybe he was like a little bit more daring.
Yeah.
But I think the grief like pummeled him into the stratosphere.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Throughout the 3 episodes, 4 through 6, kind of building even like some sexual tension with Alice.
Oh my God.
Coming from Alice,
Yes.
like on, more clearly. I was nervous throughout the entire 3 sessions that it was going to be reciprocated.
Me too.
And then in episode 6, when it wasn't, I was like really, 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 really happy, really proud of Sean. But then I was like, why am I proud of Sean? Like, that's what he should have done, right? Like he's this adult. If he is a veteran and he's home now, it's like I'm assuming he's at
least early 20s,
right?
at least.
Like a minimum of 22.
Like maybe at least. I think it depends on, how old he was when he enlisted, how long he served, but he got to be 18 to enlist. And then so he's at least 19 or 20, right? Like at least, but probably a little older. And she's in high school.
Right. And I think she's a junior because she's like talking about
colleges
next year,
and
thinking about then to apply. So, she's like 16, 17, 17 at the high end, maybe even 15 if it's the beginning of the year.
Right.
So I was really happy, that Sean was like, whoa, like, and, put that boundary. But I was like, wow, like you're a decent human being.
But then I was so mad at Jimmy for creating this whole situation for both of them. Like it's so damaging for Sean.
100%.
It's so damaging for Alice.
Yeah.
That's why it's like, what in the world are you thinking?
Right. And Alice, had disclosed to Jimmy, which is where I thought that this would all end when they went for the walk. And Sean, like, kind of did some
climb the water
risky,
tower.
Behaviors that really freaked Alice out that then she disclosed to her dad. And then, like, even Jimmy hearing Alice when she, like, opens the door right to the pool house and she's like, oh, like, you're so beautiful. And you see, I knew he was in there and I was waiting and he pops up and he's like, horrified. And I was like, okay, there we go. Like, you are now founding housing. Like, I don't care what you do.
100%.
You're also in this. So you're going to do something inappropriate because you kind of have to at this point. But get him out of the house.
I know. And then it's just like, dude, how'd you not see this coming from a mile away? And it just makes me really mad. Like I just, as the episodes, keep going on, I just get more and more infuriated with Jimmy and the fact that he's hurting all of these people around him. And I get it. Like he is really hurting, but the damage he's doing is really great, especially like to his own daughter, to his patients.
To his friends.
Yeah, it's really, really bad. So he moves in this patient, like totally inappropriate. And then even in episode 4, he's like pushing him to open up about his time overseas. Which you just don't do. And he even said as he's like jumping on the trampoline, he said something like,
oh, yes.
Open up to me. I need a win today.
I know.
That made my skin crawl. And it's like, we had already seen that with Jimmy in the earlier episodes, that he was really sort of behaving for selfish reasons as this therapist. Like, again, like, I have this new approach. It's working. Like, this is great. Trying to make himself feel better in his grief. But to say it that directly was so disgusting. And I think Sean even said to him, like, fuck you. And appropriately so. But it's just really, I'm so worried about Sean.
It's really dangerous what Jimmy has him in the position of. And even so, like, again, can you imagine if Sean had responded to Alice? It's like,
I know.
Jimmy, yes, we're all responsible for our specific behaviors at the end of the day, but like Jimmy, you have
created this situation, right? And you've also created this situation now for your daughter, who has lost her mother and is grieving, to grow attached to someone and now feel rejected.
Right?
Good job, Dad of the Year. Like, I'm just so angry at him.
Yeah, I know. I was mad at Jimmy a lot of the time in these episodes, and then then he apologizes to Sean. I'm like, it's not enough.
It's totally not enough.
The entire thing is so damaging. So anything that he's doing, regardless of then him naming it later, which again, like, some of the things are good, and like, we can misspeak in a session, we can push too hard, and then maybe we do apologize to the patient or say, hey, like I took this risk. You're not ready. I appreciate that. There's ways to repair, stuff like that. But again, because it's already coming from such an inappropriate place, it feels really, really, really dangerous.
It does. And that's where I'm just like, and Paul, you're not intervening? Like, come on, Paul. I get the sense Paul like owns the practice.
Yeah.
I might be making that up in my own head. But it's concerning to me that no one's like legitimately intervening on behalf of these patients.
Right.
And, I think as we get to know Sean better, it seems like he's the central patient character, in the show. There's other patients. I miss the angry man. But it seems like that's the central doctor or therapist-patient relationship. Once we knew he was a veteran, you start thinking, oh, he's probably going to, depict PTSD. And as these sort of episodes go on, you totally see the symptoms of PTSD. We wanted to talk about, like, what is PTSD? How do you recognize it? How do you help people with it?
So it seems that, there was really an exposure, which like is the kind of first criteria that you look at. It doesn't have to be direct. So you could experience something firsthand, see something happen to someone else firsthand, learn about something
100%.
that happened to someone else. So, if we think about like first responder kind of walking into a scene,
100%.
like, they're seeing it. Or if then the first responder goes home and talks to their partner about it in a really, really graphic way, like, again, kind of so on and so forth. Or, like if a person was a part of some kind of trauma. I mean, it can, and we talk about big T, little t, like, so it doesn't have to be war, car accidents or
natural disasters.
Falling, like in a really scary way, skiing, feeling like you are drowning for a moment. Like all of these things can really kind of trigger that response.
Childhood neglect. Stalking. Which we talk about a lot. That's so important, I think, for people to understand is, I think classically we think about PTSD coming from a big T trauma, something like a singular episode of something really bad that happened to you, like a car accident, a sexual assault, a war, things like that. But there's also, and I don't love the big T, little t because I don't want to minimize the other stuff. I think it's just to say, like, there's more to it than that.
Right.
Like, I could be misremembering this, but I believe with the latest version of the DSM, which is sort of the diagnostic manual that mental health professionals use. Again, not everyone fits neatly into these little boxes, but it helps give you at least some scaffold, some framework. They did add to, this definition of trauma, not just something you've directly experienced, but bearing witness to it, hearing about it, witnessing something on the news that you're afraid could happen, like school shootings. I think that's a really good example that even if you haven't personally experienced that, like collectively our culture is really traumatized by that. COVID, we have all experienced a big T trauma. So that's part of it. And so clearly for Sean, being a veteran going to war, a lot of traumas, I'm sure, involved, whether it was combat, whether it was just being on alert all the time. There can be some really toxic traits, unfortunately, of military culture. So certainly he displays that. And then the other classic symptoms of PTSD.
Yeah. So like typically you're presenting with some kind of avoidance symptoms. So, you're trying to not remember it. You don't want to talk about it. Trying to avoid kind of any reminders of the experience. Some intrusion symptoms kind of regardless of the avoidance. So you might be having flashbacks, nightmares, just kind of thoughts popping into your head without you wanting them to be there. Against your will, so to speak. So I often think of it as like a soda bottle. Like you shake it up and it might just pop the lid off. Like you have no control of it anymore. And so ideally, like even if you have experienced something that was really significantly stressful or a trauma, like you want control over that lid. You want to be able to open it and nothing comes out. You can glance in, think about it, process it. And then you have the control and the power and the ability to put kind of back on the lid. And when I think you are experiencing trauma symptoms, you have no control of that lid. It's popping on and off all the time, going everywhere, kind of making you feel really activated and other symptoms
like hyperarousal, hypervigilance. Oftentimes people with PTSD are really jumpy, like a door could slam and they like jump out of their seat. I'll never forget in my training, we were doing neuropsych testing with a veteran and someone shut a door like down the hall, like it wasn't that loud. And he jumped up and like opened our door. And it was like the most striking example of hyperarousal I'd seen up to that point. But even like in your day to day,
Yep.
you just jump a little more jumpy than usual. Like even things as simple as like you're getting your eyebrows waxed and they rip it off. You might just jump more than another person.
Mm-hmm.
And then some other, I think the other classic category of symptoms would be altered mood, and thoughts about yourself, other people, and
The
kind of the
world.
safety of the world
Yeah.
around you. Exactly. So I love your soda bottle example. I think that's great, especially because I think of it as like the avoidant behaviors, which sometimes include things like drug or alcohol abuse, or like
Yeah.
we talked about before, overworking is another big one.
Mm-hmm.
Just throwing yourself into work or some other activity to try to avoid thinking about it. The problem is, with avoidance, that's basically the same thing as like shaking up the soda bottle. It will come out
Yeah.
in some way. And that's one of like the first steps in treating PTSD, right? Is helping people feel comfortable to start like staying with those thoughts and memories when they come up and processing them. So PTSD, the neurobiology is really fascinating. We think of it as a disorder of kind of stuckness. So most people will experience at least one trauma in their life, if not more. Um, and so again, that doesn't just include major things like war or natural disasters. It includes like a home invasion, like all sorts of different things. So most people will experience that. And what happens in your brain, so this is where I get to nerd out because I love neuroscience. So when you experience something scary, this deep part of your brain called the amygdala lights up really, really quickly, really strongly. And it's a primitive part of our brains that we share with other animals like reptiles, birds, like all other animals that have some form of cognitive function, but they don't have like the parts of our brain, the frontal lobes that make us humans. So the amygdala lights up really quick and it sends neural signals to the parts of your brain that are meant to get you out of danger. So that's where we think about the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn approach. Mostly people talk about it as like fight or flight. Those are like the major things. The parts of your brain to either fight for your life get lit up or to flight, to run away, the motor parts of your brain to like get your body out of there. There's also that, you might freeze or play dead or feel paralyzed. That's really scary. And then you might fawn or, we kind of saw this in you when people were trapped in the cage. They would try to like appeal to their tormentor by fawning over them, getting on their good side, trying to like stay in their good graces so that they could survive. You think about if someone's like kidnapped or something like that. So when your amygdala gets activated and you're terrified and under going through some sort of traumatic event, those parts of your brain get lit up really quick and you try to get out of there as best you can. The example I often use with patients is like a fender bender. So let's say you're like in a fender bender, right? Everyone like, oh my God, my car got tapped. Like your adrenaline immediately like fires, right? You feel a little shaky, maybe a little weak, a little nervous. If there's anyone else in the car, you kind of check, make sure they're okay. You might get out of the car, make sure your car's okay, make sure the other person's is okay. And then usually by that point, you're still feeling that adrenaline, but it starts to come down because what's supposed to happen is your frontal lobes, the part of our brains as humans that's involved in thinking, executive function, reasoning, logic, that part's supposed to come on board. And it feeds back to this loop between the amygdala and these more primitive parts of your brain. And you sort of can say to yourself, whew, okay, we're all right. That was scary, but we're all okay. Okay, maybe you exchange insurance information, maybe not, but you like get back in the car and you drive away. Now, your adrenaline response doesn't immediately go away. You might feel a little shaky as you're driving. You might drive a little slower, be a little more cautious, feel a little shaken up for a while, but eventually you feel back to normal. And that's like how the natural trauma response is meant to be. So when we think about PTSD, what happens is that frontal lobe part never turns on and you stay stuck in this loop between the amygdala and those other parts of your brain that just keep firing that trauma response because it was so terrifying that in any reminder of it in present day just sets it off. And then if you avoid it, you don't give yourself the chance in your frontal lobes, really the chance to like come on board and help you talk through it. So that's really what a lot of the different therapies and medications treating PTSD are really targeting. And so I just find that fascinating. It's so cool that nowadays we do have like functional MRI scans and all these other like brain scans where researchers can really demonstrate this stuff and like demonstrate those loops and then how people get better. So I always tell patients, again, I did a lot of training at the VA. I love treating PTSD because you can get better. Like we know how to help you get better. Can we erase it? Like eternal sunshine of the spotless mind? We should add that to our list, by the way. No. But we can help you be able to like put that lid on the soda, open it up a little bit, then put it away and not feel so like just overrun with it. Right. It still might come up, but you're not going to feel so terrified. And that's how you can have like feel more empowered over it. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I think like Sean is initially, which as we kind of know makes sense. He's having like a lot of avoidance, even within, the therapeutic relationship to not want to go there yet,
And it's like, so early. Yeah. And he doesn't feel safe with Jimmy because he's living at his house and he's got no like boundaries or containment or like anything. Right. And then he's pushing him. Oh, it's just awful. Yeah.
And you see the trigger, right, of... So Sean's dad reaches out, and so they...
And Jimmy pushes him to go.
Right. So he goes, and it seems like it's, maybe it's okay. But then he gives him, the medals. Yeah, that they framed because, again, they're so proud of him in that way. And, like, I think that's what's also hard for someone maybe on the outside who's... living or has a relationship with a family member who has really pretty significant PTSD. I'm thinking more of like traditionally speaking of a veteran, like having a really hard time understanding or helping them or not, really getting why like he doesn't want to think about it at all. Like he doesn't want you to thank him for the service.
Yeah, right? Like looking at this. Right. And again, it's like... his dad probably needs some therapy too, and they probably need some family therapy to
psychoeducation.
100%, just to like learn how to help each other. But that, again, I thought was actually a really good depiction of how this stuff can come up in families, and just his dad's trying to come from a good place, right? But it's just missing the mark. And I think it's just because they don't really know now how to relate to each other. And this is so hard for Sean to talk about. And being pushed to talk about it before you are ready is re-traumatizing. Right. And that's so dangerous because these patients have already been through situations where they felt out of control. And it's so important when you're doing this work with people that they feel in control. And when you're pushing them to do something before they're ready, forget it. Just forget it.
I went to a talk of a veteran who was in school to be a therapist. And so he was sharing just some information with then I think it was his like supervisor of the program that he was in, who works very, I think her whole job is working like within Veterans Affairs and treatment. And he talked a lot about like moral injuries.
Yes.
Being so difficult to, and again, that's what he had even shared feels like there's more of in the last couple
100%,
wars
100%.
Than, in the World War I and II, it was like your duty, you went off and did this. And now he talked a lot about his experience in Iraq. And there, it's like there's no rules anymore. There's 100%. Like children.
There's children who are armed.
There's animals. And that he shared is wildly more in his, in his mind, which I tend to agree with, like damaging.
Yes.
So there's a lot of shame and guilt.
100%.
You're not just fighting, an equal enemy. It's like you're doing these horrific things that you never expected to do.
100%. Right. Like back in the day, I think it would be like, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Like both opposing teams like show up at Bunker Hill and they're like, ready, go or something. Yep. Whereas now it's like there's IEDs. Women and children are armed.
The world of war has changed, and there's new, scary realities out there. Of course, war has always been horrific and traumatizing,
and there's no boundaries anymore. It can be anywhere, and I think that's what makes it especially terrifying. There certainly is a lot more acknowledgement and training and treatment available about PTSD, like now compared to when the Vietnam vets came back. that can actually lead to an interesting tension between different generations of veterans that I saw a lot of in my training. But we did just want to put out a plug for the VA healthcare system because it can be so supportive and there's so many resources available to veterans. So if you or someone you love is a veteran and seeking treatment, please reach out to your VA. This is what they do day in and day out. Again, there's so many different VAs around the country. If you've been to one VA, you've only been to one VA. So if you've had a bad experience, please give another one a try. There's so much help and treatment out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we see Sean like at the at the beginning stages of treatment in general. And like, he's also in this really inappropriate relationship. And like, I just want him to get really good care.
I know. And this is, sorry to interrupt you, but it reminded me that, the fight that initially got him into sort of like court-ordered treatment is super common. And fighting like that is often like a hyperarousal thing. Someone could tap you on the shoulder. You're a veteran, like you spring into action and you can't, like your amygdala is firing so quick. So that's a perfect example. 100%, which is another avoidance cluster. So I'm sure over time we'll keep talking about PTSD and talk more about the different treatments available. But so far, Sean is, I think, a pretty good depiction of it. And I'm really dissatisfied with the care that he's getting.
Yeah. We see in episode 6, kind of at the end, we see Paul kind of being able to pull at Sean a little bit and have him open up, and they're in the pool house, and like Jimmy is really like mad again and making it about himself, and he's like, well, why aren't you opening up to me, or I can't believe this. And it's like, maybe it's because you're in a really inappropriate relationship with a client. Maybe he's not ready. Maybe, maybe it's an age thing. Maybe Paul, is playing to some sort of, friendly mentor, father figure. I don't know, he's for like, Sean.
Right. Also, maybe it's, Paul was like, it'll really piss Jimmy off if you open up to me.
They're aligning. Yeah.
They're drinking a beer together. Not great boundary. I think also Paul sharing something about him helped in that situation. And, it brings up again the topic of like self-disclosure, like when is it okay, when is it not okay? I thought personally that sharing the specifics about like his diagnosis and with his daughter was too far. But I liked the gist of it. And I think, if this were real life and like real treatment, there would be a way to share something like in generalities, like, we all have things that is really hard to talk to our family members about, I don't know, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
Gosh, so we have spent already like a whole episode just on this, and we really want to dive into Harrison Ford and the weed gummies. So I think we're going to wrap up there, and we're actually going to split this into 2 episodes. We're just flying by the seat of our pants.
Yeah. I mean, so, just hit next if you would like to hear about that.
Oh my God, maybe we'll do like a double drop or something. Woohoo. Ooh, we can figure that out. That's exciting. So thank you for listening. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Follow us on Instagram at Analyze Scripts. Check out our website, www.analyzescripts.com. And feel free to email us at analyzescriptspodcast@gmail.com with any recommendations, any thoughts, any questions. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye. This podcast and its contents are a copyright of Analyze Scripts, all rights reserved. Any redistribution or reproduction of part or all of the contents in any form is prohibited. Unless you want to share it with your friends and rate, review, and subscribe, that's fine. All stories and characters discussed are fictional in nature. No identification with actual persons, living or deceased, places, buildings, or products is intended or should be inferred. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The podcast and its contents do not constitute professional, mental health, or medical advice. Listeners might consider consulting a mental health provider if they need assistance with any mental health problems or concerns. As always, please call 911 or go directly to your nearest emergency room for any psychiatric emergencies. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.